In the early hours of a damp morning in northern France, long after the gunfire had faded, rows of small box-shaped vehicles sat quietly in a field of churned mud. There, olive paint was streaked with dust and oil. Canvas tops sagged under rainwater. They looked less like machines and more like abandoned tools left behind after a job that had suddenly ended. A British sergeant walked past with a clipboard, counting, marking, moving on. There was nothing ceremonial about this. These vehicles had crossed beaches, deserts, and mountain roads. Now, they were simply surplus, waiting for a decision. This is the untold story of what happened to Britain's tens of thousands of military jeeps after World War II. It's a story not of parades and preservation, but of practicality, economics, and quiet disappearance. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing with extraordinary speed. Allied armies were advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Behind them followed a vast mechanical tail: trucks, ambulances, motorcycles, and thousands upon thousands of light utility vehicles, the Jeep. Britain had entered the war in 1939 with a very limited motor pool. 6 years later, it was part of a fully mechanized coalition. This transformation was driven by industrial necessity and foreign supply. The British Army adopted the American-made Jeep early on because it solved a huge problem. They needed a lightweight, reliable, all-terrain vehicle that could be built quickly and in enormous numbers. And by 1945, they had tens of thousands of them, all across the world. Jeeps were everywhere. Infantry units used them for reconnaissance. Engineers used them to carry tools and explosives. Medical units turned them into makeshift ambulances. They were the workhorses of the war, embedded into every level of military life. But when the fighting ended, the British Army faced a logistical question, not a sentimental one. What do we do with all of them? The answer was shaped by exhaustion, economics, and the harsh realities of a country emerging from 6 years of total war. Britain had relied heavily on Allied industrial output, especially from the United States. These vehicles were supplied rapidly, designed to be used hard, repaired quickly, and replaced when worn out. Longevity was never the priority. Victory was by 1944. The British Army's vehicle inventory was at an all-time high. In Northwest Europe alone, British and Commonwealth forces operated hundreds of thousands of wheeled vehicles. The Jeep was a huge part of this fleet because it was so versatile and cheap to produce. But this scale came with consequences. Every single vehicle needed fuel, spare parts, trained mechanics, and storage space. In wartime, that cost was justified. In peacetime, it was a massive burden. As demobilization began in late 1945, military planners had to shrink the armed forces to a fraction of their wartime size. Millions of servicemen were returning home, bases were closing, supply depots were overflowing with equipment that no longer had a purpose. The Jeeps were one of the most visible symbols of this surplus. Some were in excellent condition, but many were mechanically exhausted after years of brutal operation. Engines were worn, frames were cracked, and gearboxes were tired. The first step was assessment. British ordnance units conducted inspections across Europe. Vehicles were categorized by condition. Those deemed serviceable were kept for short-term occupation duties. The rest were marked for disposal. Disposal didn't always mean destruction. It meant getting them off the military's books. In Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, huge vehicle parks were set up. Thousands of Jeeps were gathered together, stripped of sensitive equipment like radios and weapon mounts, and had their military markings painted over. What remained was a basic utility vehicle with little strategic value. At the same time, Britain itself was in an economic crisis. The war had drained its currency reserves. Infrastructure at home was damaged. Rationing continued well into the late 1940s. The government was under immense pressure to cut spending. Maintaining a massive fleet of surplus vehicles overseas was just not feasible. So a huge number of these British-used Jeeps were sold locally in continental Europe. The civilian markets were desperate for transport. Farms, businesses, and construction sites needed vehicles, and domestic production hadn't recovered yet. The rugged, cheap Jeep was the perfect solution. In France and Belgium, former military Jeeps started popping up on farms and rural roads. Some were converted into tractors or utility trucks. These sales were often handled through government auctions with low prices. The priority wasn't profit, it was clearance. Every vehicle sold reduced storage costs. But not all of them found new owners. In regions where demand was low or transport costs were too high, the Jeeps were simply scrapped. Metal was valuable after the war, so steel, aluminum, copper, and rubber could all be reclaimed. In some cases, entire vehicle parks were dismantled right on site. Frames were cut up, engines were stripped, and anything useful was separated from the waste. It was an unsentimental and efficient process. Back then, the Jeep wasn't seen as a historic artifact. It was a tool, and when a tool is no longer needed, it gets recycled. Back in Britain, the situation was a bit different. Civilian demand for cars was high, but not all military vehicles were suitable for British roads. Many Jeeps were left-hand drive, their fuel consumption was high for peacetime, and spare parts were hard to find. As a result, only a limited number of Jeeps entered civilian life in the UK. The ones that did were often used by government agencies like the Forestry Commission, where their off-road capability was still valuable. The vast majority of Jeeps used by the British Army never actually returned home. Overseas, in places like the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, the story was similar. Jeeps were passed on to local authorities, allied forces, or civilian buyers. In some countries, they stayed in service for decades, kept running with improvised repairs and locally made parts. In others, they vanished quickly, cannibalized for spares or just worn out completely. There was very little effort to preserve them as symbols of victory. In the late 1940s, Britain was focused on rebuilding houses, industry, and social services. Nostalgia was a luxury it couldn't afford. Space and resources were limited. The kind of military heritage preservation we see today just wasn't a priority. The Jeep, despite its iconic role, was subject to the same cold logic as any other piece of surplus equipment. From a technical standpoint, this was predictable. The vehicle was designed for rapid wartime production, not long-term durability. It had minimal rust protection and basic electrical systems. In an era moving towards enclosed cars with more comfort, the Jeep was already becoming obsolete. By the early 1950s, Britain's armed forces had moved on to newer vehicle designs tailored for the Cold War. The few surviving wartime Jeeps were either replaced or relegated to secondary roles. What we see today is only a tiny fraction of what once existed. The Jeeps in museums, private collections, and historical reenactments are the survivors of a vast forgotten process of disposal. For every single one that was saved, hundreds were sold, scrapped, or simply driven until they fell apart. Historians now see this as a perfect reflection of Britain's post-war reality. The country was victorious, but financially exhausted. Decisions were driven by pure necessity, not sentiment. The rapid disappearance of these vehicles shows how quickly wartime abundance gave way to peacetime austerity. The true legacy of Britain's military Jeeps isn't found in preserved fleets, but in their influence. They proved the value of light, mobile transport in modern warfare and shaped post-war vehicle design. They left their mark on civilian life across continents, helping to rebuild economies. In those quiet fields where thousands of them once stood abandoned, there's little to mark their presence now. The mud is settled, the tire tracks have faded, but the story of what really happened to Britain's military Jeeps after the war can still be heard. Not in monuments, but in the practical, unsentimental decisions of a nation moving on from conflict, one vehicle at a time. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories like this. See you in the next one.